Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Why No One Plays, featuring Taliyah, the Stoneweaver. I know I had Lissandra scheduled next, but my new editor Aphrow edited the Malzahar video for free on stipulation that he gets to request any champion viable for the series, which is why I'm making Taliyah next. But conveniently, a lot of people have actually been asking me to cover Taliyah, so I guess it works. If this is your first time watching Why No One Plays, I just want to make a quick disclaimer that the title is not meant to be taken literally. Obviously there are Taliyah players, but not too many, especially in the past couple years. My goal with the series is to raise more awareness of the champion by analyzing why their gameplay or design doesn't appeal to many players. So for all the Taliyah mains out there, this is not meant to be a personal attack, but let's get right into the video. Despite being one of the most dominant junglers throughout preseason 11, Taliyah has had a rocky history ever since she was reworked to become a jungler in mid-season 8. For a few patches, she was a heavily contested pick, but then during the entirety of Season 9 and 10, she's been almost non-existent. Though yes, she's yet another battle mage, the trials and tribulations facing her are quite different from her counterparts, as she's one of the few battle mages in the game who actually has a decently designed kit. Alongside Karthus, she's also the only battle mage played in the jungle. To get into why she has a hard time picking up a dedicated player base, we have to first talk about two of her abilities, starting with her passive, Rock Surfing. Whenever out of combat, she gains ramping move speed next to terrain or structures, which gives her incredible tempo throughout the map, as her passive is essentially a built-in Mobi boost that scales into the late game. It allows her to path through the jungle very quickly, beating out some of the highest momentum junglers in the game like Hecarim, Kayn, and Rek'Sai, even though she has nothing that allows her to actually move through walls. Threaded Volley contains the bulk of her DPS. Taliyah slings 5 stone shards in a target direction over 1.5 seconds, while being able to move during that time. If all 5 stones connect on a single target, it has the potential to deal the highest damage for a single basic ability, beating out even some ultimates, all with a low cooldown and very long range, especially for a battle mage. The caveat for all this ability's strength is that it has 2 cooldowns in place. A large circle around her becomes worked ground for 45 seconds. Subsequent casts anywhere in this area only let her throw 1 shard for 1 mana. Threaded Volley is the only ability with an area-focused cooldown, or at least the only one that deals damage, since Talon's Parkour sorta shares the same property. It's these 2 abilities that make her viable in the jungle, since she has the means to not only clear jungle monsters at a fast pace, but traverse from camp to camp at a tempo few champions can match, which is ironic since battle mages are known to generally be quite slow. But therein lies a problem where her greatest strength is also her greatest weakness. Because Threaded Volley creates worked ground, Taliyah is the sole champion in all of League of Legends who has a time limit in combat. That is to say, she has an ammo supply that needs to recharge. Worked ground lasts 45 seconds, which isn't too long for an average game time lasting 25 minutes, but during a team fight or extended trades, players have to be very sparing with how they use her Q, despite being a spammable projectile that's really good at poking down enemies. All champions have cooldowns, some longer than others, but provided they aren't running low on mana, damaging abilities can usually be casted unconditionally, whereas Threaded Volley cannot. It's impossible to predict where and when teamfights will take place in a match, even near objectives like Baron or Dragon. Careless usage of her Q can come back to bite you if a fight breaks out and you're completely surrounded by worked ground. From a design standpoint, it makes perfect sense to have this mechanic. Threaded Volley would be the strongest magic damage ability in the game. Long range, short cooldown, and extremely high base damage and AP scaling. Creating worked ground is an appropriate measure to balance this attack, but it's also very uncomfortable for user experience. Imagine if you were to play Anivia and every time you use Glacial Storm, it would leave an area on the ground where you couldn't cast your ultimate again for 30 seconds. That would make her so much more inconsistent to play. Now mind you, Anivia ult and Taliyah Q are apple and orange, but most players don't like being punished for using their abilities outside of cooldowns. Some might argue that's what makes her unique and adds more depth to her kit. I agree, and once again, it's a good design choice in concept. In practice, it's something players have to be specifically aware of when playing Taliyah. As you know, people are creatures of habit. That's why we enjoy playing the same types of champions over and over again, sometimes only one champion. That's why champions with a specific playstyle or condition that applies only to them are not viable as pocket picks or autofill picks, which is why Taliyah is very rarely played unless she's viable as a solo main. The question now is, why don't a lot of people one-trick her? Taliyah is very hard to play. Now, unlike champions such as Azir, Kindred, and Kalista who are mechanically difficult, Taliyah is methodically difficult to play. By methodical, I'm talking about macro. Much of Taliyah's strengths are locked behind how well you know the game, her synergies, her pathing, and her windows of opportunity. This is of course also as a result of Threaded Volley's worked ground mechanic, preventing her from just spamming her abilities whenever she wants. As I mentioned before, she has some of the best tempo in the game. but tempo cannot be used to your advantage without an advanced level of game knowledge. That's why high diamond, master, and challenger junglers place such heavy emphasis on jungle pathing, clear speeds, and momentum. Being able to make split-second decisions without hesitation based on a constantly changing game state is very difficult to do for the vast majority of players. Taliyah can easily be one of the best junglers in the game, but she can just as easily be one of the worst. Most tanks or skirmishers tend to be relatively consistent in performance either through their innate combat potential or crowd control, but hypercarry junglers are more susceptible to becoming irrelevant if they fall behind early on, in exchange for having the ability to carry harder. All of her abilities are pretty intuitive to land. Seismic Shove is a directional knock-up tool with the same sort of timing as Cho'Gath's Rupture, only you can decide where to eject the target area, away from you, to the side, towards you, etc. Unraveled Earth scatters boulders all over an area which acts as a giant slowing field. Any enemy unit who dashes or is displaced through this area will cause the boulders to dig into them, dealing more damage. Even though this is a reactive ability, Taliyah can manually force champions to take damage from Unraveled Earth, since Seismic Shove can be used to knock people into the boulder field. Finally, her ultimate Weaver's Wall is a semi-global ability that allows her to summon a long stretch of rocks blocking an area. And she can elect to surf the wall as well, acting as both a massive zoning tool and a long-range dash not unlike Pantheon's Grand Starfall. This also ties into her high macro requirement since any champion with global ultimates have access to mobility few others can come close to. Even though all of her other abilities are easy to use, they all have long cooldowns and complex applications. Seismic Shove is the only displacement tool in the game that you can actually decide what direction to knock champions towards. Unraveled Earth requires you to set up a spot to either dissuade champions from dashing through it or to knock enemies into it, and finally, as I mentioned before, Weaver's Wall can be either a long-range dash or a physical obstruction. Just like how Azir has an endless number of ways he can position his sand soldiers using his Q, E, and ultimate, Taliyah can also use her abilities in a multitude of ways. But the difference between the two is that the former's tools are designed to be used in split-second attacks, while the latter is about setting up the board, so to speak. Why this negatively affects her play rate is that a lot of players, especially those in lower ranks, don't understand the sheer pressure she can impose on the enemy team because the importance of macro is not prevailing wisdom for 90% of the player base, which is why subtle and macro-oriented champions like Taliyah, Twisted Fate, Zillion, and such are deployed much less often than mechanical and flashy champions. While we're on the subject of specific champions, Taliyah is greatly matchup and team composition dependent, not necessarily in terms of her versus the enemy jungler, but her team versus the enemy teams. Even though she boasts impressive range, kiting, and area control, her damage is quite poor against very resilient champions like bruisers and tanks as a result of her limited DPS. Battle mages are generally very good against Hulk and Bulkins because they can fight for a very long time and attack very often during that time. But Taliyah can't, since she has a limited attack supply, and despite her Q's high damage, a tank with even a little bit of magic resist built can easily soak up 3 or 4 rounds. Especially tank supports like Leona, Nautilus, and Rel pose a serious problem for her since she has to actively move around a fight not only to keep herself alive, but to get out of worked ground so she can shoot a fully loaded threaded volley. So not only can they lock her down so she can't escape, but they're also durable enough to protect their squishies from the bulk of her damage since Q is a single target skill shot. On top of super tanky champions, she also struggles a lot against super mobile champions. You might ask why, given that Unraveled Earth is designed to damage enemies that dash through it. But there's a very big difference between damaging someone who dashes and stopping someone from dashing. All of Taliyah's attacks are skill shots, meaning they can all be avoided, and even though she's a great zoner, her attacks are kinda slow. Threaded volley casts over 1.5 seconds, very difficult to hit a moving target with all 5 shots unless they're slowed or immobilized. Seismic Shove takes 1 second to knock enemies up, more than enough time for someone to dash out of it or even use Protobelt, Stride Breaker, or Gale Force since it has a very small effect radius, and while Unraveled Earth does deal a good amount of damage, hard engagers like Jarvan IV, Hecarim, Vi, Camille, and Diana are more than capable of face tanking several boulders due to their natural durability. That's not to say Taliyah is incapable of handling those champions, but in most cases, she can't win against them on her own and depends on her team to back her up, because she gets completely steamrolled by champions who excel in blitzing people down. This has only become worse over time as jungle has become so early game focused that games can be decided on which team wins the first Scuttle Crab skirmish. Even prior to the jungle changes, Taliyah always had a hard time against assassins and fighters on account of her vulnerability and slow attacks, meaning the only way she can win against them is if she has the element of surprise, because even missing one string of Qs or Seismic Shove puts you at the mercy of your opponent since you don't have any defensive abilities or get off me tools the way other battle mages do. Technically speaking, Karthus also shares the same problem, but he makes up for it by still being able to fight even while dead. Again, this is why she's so macro-oriented, because she has to dance on a very fine line to not make too many mistakes in the early game. Fortunately, Taliyah is an incredibly effective ganker, which means if you're looking for someone who can get a lot done in the early game, she has that going for her. But if the enemy jungler is playing an early game skirmisher like Hecarim, Rengar, or Master Yi, you can be an easy target if snuffed out alone in the jungle. Putting it together, Taliyah is a very methodical champion. It takes someone with a strong understanding of the game, not just their own champion, but other champions and your understanding of the jungle. She can't just face roll all over the keyboard to be played well. The only time she reaches a high play rate is if she's noticeably stronger than other champions, which is why she became such a top tier pick during early Season 11 when Threaded Volley was buffed to deal full damage to monsters. That made her already decent clear speed even faster. But making a champion strong to be popular applies to just about any champion. The higher their numbers, the wider their margin for error. All the same, Taliyah by design is very well crafted. Her abilities are unique, strong, and in the hands of the right player she can be a menace to deal with, and a really enjoyable champion to one-trick. Her lack of popularity is technically at the fault of the players. Now, whether or not good design is based on user experience only, or if it's based on the constraints of the game, that's a topic for debate that we can discuss at another time. For now, I think we'll wrap it up here. If you enjoyed this video, a rating would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to see more content like this, please be sure to sub to the channel. Also check out the video description down below for links to my Discord and social medias, as well as a playlist containing all my past episodes of Why No One Plays if you want to see more. But that's it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.